In the weathered corner of Millbrook, Frank Harmon's auto shop had seen better days. Grease-stained floors and the persistent smell of motor oil told the story of 30 years fixing engines until that rainy Tuesday morning. The whimpering sound beneath Mrs. Patterson's sedan stopped Frank cold. Crawling under the chassis, his weathered hands discovered a trembling German shepherd, ribs protruding, eyes filled with terror. Something in those eyes reminded Frank of himself, forgotten, struggling to survive. With gentle movements, he coaxed the dog into freedom, never suspecting this moment would change everything. But how could a simple mechanic and a stray dog transform an entire community? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Frank Harmon wiped his hands on the rag tucked into his belt, a gesture so ingrained he hardly noticed it anymore. The toolbox beside him, dented, scratched, but meticulously organized, had belonged to his father and his grandfather. Before that, 3 generations of Harmon men had fixed engines in Millbrook with these same tools, though Frank suspected he might be the last. The rain hammered against the corrugated metal roof of Harmon's auto, a symphony Frank had listened to for 30 years. Once the shop had hummed with activity, 3 bays filled, 2 assistants rushing between jobs, phones ringing with appointments scheduled weeks in advance. Now it was just Frank and occasionally Mike, a 19-year-old community college student who showed promise but lacked the patience good mechanical work demanded. Frank glanced at the calendar on the wall, red circles marking payment deadlines. The bank wouldn't wait much longer. When the Henderson manufacturing plant closed 5 years ago, it took 200 jobs and much of Frank's business with it. The remaining customers were mostly old-timers like himself, driving vehicles well past their prime because replacing them wasn't an option. Mr. Harmon. The voice belonged to Eleanor Patterson, 73, widow of Frank's former high school math teacher. "I hate to bother you, but my car's making that noise again." Frank smiled, the creases around his eyes deepening. "No bother, Mrs. Patterson. Let's have a look." Eleanor Patterson's 1998 Buick Century had more stories than miles, though the odometer had rolled over once already. Frank had kept it running through sheer determination and creative solutions when parts were no longer available. "It started after I hit that pothole on Maple Street," she explained, her arthritic hands clutching her purse. "The city says they'll fix it next spring, but that doesn't help anyone now." Frank nodded, knowing Mrs. Patterson lived on a fixed income that stretched thinner each year. "Let me just listen to her first," he said, referring to the car as he always did. Machines had personalities to Frank, quirks and temperaments that revealed themselves if you paid attention. The rain had slowed to a drizzle as Frank followed Mrs. Patterson outside. The Buick sat at an odd angle, the front passenger side slightly lower than the rest. Potential tie rod issue, Frank thought automatically, though he'd reserved judgment until he got a closer look. "Mind starting her up for me?" he asked, crouching down despite the protest from his right knee. The injury, a souvenir from a high school football championship game 40 years prior, always announced itself in damp weather. Mrs. Patterson slid behind the wheel while Frank positioned himself to see underneath the chassis. The engine turned, over with a cough, then settled into an uneven idle. Frank could identify at least 3 separate issues from the sound alone. The bill would be more than Mrs. Patterson could afford, and they both knew he'd find a way to cut the cost without making it feel like charity. That's when he heard it, a faint whimpering that didn't belong to any mechanical component. Frank tilted his head, wondering if his ears were playing tricks. The sound came again, definitely from underneath the car, but not from the engine. "Mrs. Patterson," he called, "could you turn off the engine for a moment?" The sudden silence made the whimpering more distinct. Frank lowered himself to the wet pavement, ignoring the water seeping through his coveralls. He pulled a small flashlight from his pocket and directed the beam toward the sound. A pair of eyes reflected the light back at him, frightened, confused, and undeniably alive. "Good Lord," Frank whispered, his flashlight illuminating the trembling form wedged between the undercarriage and the axle. A German shepherd, or mostly so, its coat matted with mud and what looked like dried blood in places. The dog's ribs pressed against its skin like keys on a xylophone, and one paw was awkwardly tucked beneath its body. "What is it, Mr. Harmon?" Mrs. Patterson called from above. "It's a dog, Mrs. Patterson. Looks like it crawled under your car, maybe during the storm last night." Frank spoke softly, extending his hand palm up toward the animal. The dog growled, weakly, more fear than threat behind the sound. Its eyes, amber and intelligent despite the fear, reminded Frank of something he couldn't quite place. "Poor thing," Mrs. Patterson said, now standing at a safe distance. "Is it hurt?" Frank couldn't tell without getting closer, and the dog wasn't ready to trust him yet. "Might be. Let me get something." He returned from the shop with a package of beef jerky he kept in his desk drawer for long workdays. Tearing off a small piece, he offered it to the dog, who sniffed cautiously before accepting the food with gentle teeth. "That's right," Frank murmured. "Nobody's going to hurt you." After several more pieces, the dog allowed Frank to touch its head, then examine the rest of its body. No collar or tags. The paw wasn't broken, just sprained from what Frank could tell. The real concern was the dog's emaciated state, and the cuts along its flank that suggested it had escaped from somewhere, or someone. Frank had never considered himself a dog person. After Elaine died 5 years ago, he'd deliberately avoided attachments of any kind. The shop was enough responsibility, but something in those amber eyes tugged at a part of him he thought had died alongside his wife. He reached into his wallet and removed a worn photograph. Elaine at their 40th anniversary dinner, smiling despite the cancer that would take her 3 months later. She'd always wanted a dog. "Mr. Harmon?" Mrs. Patterson's voice broke through his memories. "Should we call animal control?" Frank knew what that meant in a town with Millbrook's limited resources. The county shelter was always overcrowded, and an adult dog with injuries would have poor chances of adoption. "No need to bother them," Frank said, surprising himself. "I'll take care of it." As if understanding, the dog edged closer to Frank, allowing him to run a hand along its side. The rain had stopped completely now, and thin sunlight broke through the clouds. "Let me help you get it out from under there," Mrs. Patterson offered, her face soft with concern. Together, they coaxed the dog from its hiding place. Standing on 3 legs, favoring the injured paw, the German shepherd was still a magnificent animal beneath the dirt and neglect. "What will you do with it?" Mrs. Patterson asked. Frank hadn't thought that far ahead. He glanced at the shop, then at the small apartment above where he'd lived alone since Elaine passed. "I'll take it to Doc Miller first, see if it's microchipped," he said, referring to the local veterinarian who occasionally stopped by the shop to have his truck serviced. "After that, we'll see." Inside the shop, Frank's apprentice Mike looked up from the oil change he was performing, his eyes widening at the sight of the dog. "Whoa, where'd that come from?" "Under Mrs. Patterson's car," Frank explained, grabbing an old blanket from the supply closet and creating a makeshift bed in the corner of his office. "Mind finishing up the diagnostic on the Buick? I need to make a call." As Mike nodded, Frank noticed the way the dog watched the young man work, not with fear, but with an almost studious attention that seemed unusual. When Mike dropped a wrench, the dog's ears perked forward, tracking the sound with remarkable focus. Frank didn't believe in signs or fate. Life had taught him that good things rarely happened without effort, and bad things came regardless of what you deserved. But as he picked up the phone to call Doc Miller, he couldn't shake the feeling that finding this dog wasn't mere coincidence. Doc Miller's examination confirmed what Frank already suspected. The German shepherd was severely malnourished, but otherwise healthy, aside from the sprained paw and superficial cuts. No microchip, no collar marks suggesting one had been removed. "I'd say he's about 3 years old," Doc Miller said, gently massaging the dog's ears. "Someone trained him at some point. See how he sits when I gesture?" he demonstrated, and the dog immediately sat despite its obvious discomfort. "So he belongs to someone," Frank said, feeling an unexpected disappointment. "Belonged, maybe," Doc corrected. "But given his condition, I'd say he's been on his own for weeks, maybe months. I can call around, put up some notices, but—" Frank nodded, understanding the unspoken reality. In a county where people regularly abandoned pets they couldn't afford to feed, the chances of finding this dog's original owner were slim, and perhaps not even desirable. "What would it cost to get him back on his feet?" Frank asked, already mentally reviewing the shop's ledger. The quarterly property tax was due next week, and supplier payments were overdue. Doc Miller seemed to read his thoughts. "For you? Just the cost of the medications. Consider it payment for fixing my truck's transmission last winter." Back at the shop, Frank cleared space in his small apartment above the garage. It wasn't much, a bedroom, bathroom, kitchenette, and living area that doubled as a dining room, but it was clean and quiet. The dog followed him cautiously up the narrow staircase, limping but determined. "Just temporary," Frank told the dog, setting down bowls of water and the special food Doc Miller had provided. "Until we figure something out." The dog didn't respond, of course, but those intelligent eyes watched Frank's every move as if memorizing his patterns. That night, Frank sat at his small kitchen table, the shop's ledger open before him. Red ink dominated the pages. Mortgage, payments, utilities, insurance, supplier invoices. The bank had made it clear last month that their patience was wearing thin. With the new chain auto shop breaking ground on the edge of town, Frank's remaining customers would have more options, most with flashier facilities and cheaper prices. A soft whine drew his attention. The dog stood in the doorway watching him. "Can't sleep either, huh?" Frank said, surprising himself by patting the chair beside him. The dog approached cautiously, then rested its head on Frank's knee. "You need a name," Frank mused, scratching. "Behind the dog's ears, just until your real owner turns up." But even as he said it, Frank felt a strange protectiveness toward the animal. "Diesel," he decided, the name coming to him unexpectedly. "It suits you." The newly named Diesel seemed to approve, pressing closer to Frank's leg. Morning came too quickly. Frank's routine, unchanged for years, now accommodated a four-legged shadow. Diesel followed him to the bathroom, watched him make coffee, and waited patiently by the door when Frank indicated it was time to go downstairs. "You can't stay in the shop," Frank told him firmly. "Customers, safety regulations." But Diesel's steady gaze wore him down. "Fine, just for today, but you stay in the office, understand?" As Frank descended the stairs, Diesel limping behind, he wondered when he'd started talking to dogs, as if they could comprehend complex sentences. The shop's morning light revealed what evening shadows had hidden. Notices from the bank marked "Final Warning," supplier invoices stamped "Past Due," and the monthly utility bill that had nearly doubled since last year. Frank tucked them all into the top drawer of his desk, a temporary solution to a permanent problem. Clara, from the diner next door, poked her head in the side entrance, carrying a paper bag that smelled of bacon and coffee. "Thought you might—" She stopped, noticing Diesel. "Well, hello there. When did you get a dog?" "I didn't," Frank said quickly. "Found him under Mrs. Patterson's car yesterday, just keeping him until the owner turns up." Clara, 60-something with hennaed hair and knowing eyes, gave Frank a look that said she wasn't convinced. "Uh-huh. And I'm just holding these lottery tickets for a friend." She set the bag on his desk. "On the house today. Looks like your friend could use some protein." Frank started to protest, but Clara was already breaking off a piece of bacon. For Diesel, who accepted it with surprising gentleness. "He's got manners," she observed, "unlike some of my customers." The morning brought a steady stream of customers, unusual for a Wednesday. Frank suspected Clara had spread the word about Diesel. Each person who entered the shop found some reason to wander near the office, where Diesel rested on his blanket, offering approving nods or curious questions. "German Shepherd, right?" Tom Watson asked, the hardware store owner who'd been bringing his ancient pickup to Frank for 20 years. "Smart dogs. My cousin trained them for police work down in Columbus." Frank nodded, sliding beneath Tom's truck to check the brake lines. "This one seems to catch on quick, knows to stay put when I tell him." By noon, Diesel had grown restless in the confines of the office. His paw seemed better, he was putting more weight on it now, and his eyes followed Frank's movements around the shop with increasing interest. "All right." Frank relented after his fourth trip to check on the dog. "But stay out of the way." He led Diesel to a corner of the shop where an old rug, originally brought in to soak up an oil spill, now served as a makeshift bed. Frank opened the first aid kit he kept on the wall, cleaning Diesel's paws with antiseptic wipes before bandaging the sprained one. The dog sat perfectly still during the treatment, only wincing slightly when Frank touched tender spots. "Good boy," Frank murmured, surprised by how natural the words felt. Mike arrived for his afternoon shift, eyebrows rising at the sight of Diesel in the shop. "Thought you were taking him to the shelter," he said, setting down his backpack. "Tomorrow," Frank replied, though he was already questioning that plan. "He's still getting his strength back." Mike shrugged, turning his attention to a Chevy Malibu with transmission issues. Frank noticed how Diesel watched the young man work, head tilted, as if analyzing his technique. The afternoon brought Ray Fulton and his problematic Ford F-150. Ray, perpetually short on cash but long on excuses, needed his truck for work but consistently neglected basic maintenance. "Just a quick look," Ray insisted. "Probably nothing serious." Frank knew better, but he also knew Ray's 3 kids and recently laid-off wife depended on that truck running. He sighed, wiping his hands. "On a rag. Pull it into Bay 3, I'll see what I can do." As Frank suspected, the problem wasn't minor. The timing belt was showing dangerous wear, the oil was sludge-like, and one of the brake calipers was on the verge of seizing. He collected the necessary parts from his dwindling inventory, mentally calculating a bill he knew Ray couldn't pay in full. The supplier's truck pulled up outside, and Frank tensed. Bill Henderson had been clear last time. No more parts on credit until the outstanding balance was paid. Frank watched through the open bay door as the delivery driver approached, invoice in hand. "Frank," the driver nodded, "all professional." A formality where once there had been friendly chatter. "Got your order, but Bill says it's cod from now on." Frank wiped his hands slowly, buying time. "Jack, you know I'm good for it. Just waiting on some payments to come through." Jack looked uncomfortable. "Bill's orders, Frank. Nothing personal." Before Frank could respond, a metallic clang echoed through the shop. He'd dropped a wrench, which had skidded beneath the hydraulic lift. Frank cursed under his breath, preparing to crouch down despite his protesting knee, but Diesel was already moving, limping slightly but determined. Before either man could react, the German Shepherd had retrieved the wrench and was carrying it to Frank, tail wagging tentatively. "Well, I'll be damned," Jack said, staring at the dog. Frank was equally surprised, taking the wrench from Diesel's gentle grip. "Thanks, boy. That's something you don't see every day," Jack continued, his professional demeanor softening. "Dog knows his tools, huh?" Frank patted Diesel's head, noticing how the dog leaned into his touch. "Seems that way." Jack looked from the dog to the invoice in his hand, then back again. "Tell you what, I'll tell Bill you paid half today, the rest by next delivery." "Appreciate it," Frank said, relief washing over him. After Jack left, Frank stared at the wrench in his hand, then at Diesel, who sat watching him expectantly. Something had shifted, though Frank couldn't quite name it yet. "Well," he told the dog, "looks like you've earned your dinner." That evening, after closing shop, Frank decided to test a theory. He placed 3 tools on the ground, a socket wrench, pliers and a screwdriver, and sat beside them with Diesel. "Socket wrench," Frank said clearly, pointing to the tool. Diesel tilted his head, amber eyes focused. Frank repeated the name, then picked up the tool, letting Diesel sniff it before setting it down again. "Socket wrench," he said once more. Then, "Fetch." Diesel looked at the three tools, hesitated, then picked up the socket wrench and brought it to Frank. "Good boy," Frank said, surprised and pleased. He offered a small treat from the bag Doc Miller had provided. They continued for nearly an hour, Frank naming each tool multiple times before asking Diesel to retrieve it. By the end, the dog could reliably identify and fetch each one. "Somebody trained you well," Frank murmured, scratching behind Diesel's ears. The dog leaned into his touch, eyes half closed in contentment. The next morning, Frank made a stop before opening the shop. The pet store on Main Street was small, but well stocked, and the owner, Marianne, greeted him warmly. "Frank Harmon! Don't tell me you've finally gotten a pet?" Frank shifted uncomfortably. "Not exactly, just helping out a stray until we find his owner." Marianne's knowing smile matched Clara's from the day before. "Of course. And what does this temporary visitor need?" 20 minutes later, Frank left with more supplies than he'd intended. A proper collar and leash, a dog bed, food and water bowls, high-quality dog food, and several chew toys. The collar, a sturdy leather one with a brass nameplate, felt like a commitment Frank wasn't ready to acknowledge. At the shop, Diesel greeted him with enthusiastic tail wagging that transformed into dignified stillness when Frank showed him the collar. "Hold still," Frank instructed, and Diesel obeyed, allowing Frank to fasten the collar around his neck. The nameplate was blank. Frank still insisted this was temporary, despite the growing evidence to the contrary. "Looking sharp," Mike commented, arriving for his shift. The young man had warmed to Diesel, sneaking him treats when he thought Frank wasn't looking. Business picked up as the day progressed. Word had spread about the mechanic's dog, bringing in curious customers with minor issues they'd previously ignored. Frank found himself explaining multiple times that Diesel was just staying temporarily, though each repetition sounded less convincing. During a lull, Mike approached Frank with his phone in hand. "You should really get a social media account for the shop," he suggested. "Places like Jensen's Automotive get all kinds of business from their online presence." Frank frowned. Jensen's was the chain auto shop breaking ground at the edge of town, threatening what remained of Frank's customer base. "I fix cars, Mike. Don't need the internet for that." "Just saying," Mike persisted. "People like seeing behind the scenes. Builds trust. And with Diesel here..." He let the implication hang. Before Frank could respond, the front door chimed. A man in a crisp button-down shirt entered, his polished appearance out of place among the grease and tools. "Frank Harmon?" he asked, extending a hand. "David Mercer, Jensen's Automotive. Thought I'd introduce myself, neighbor to neighbor." Frank wiped his hands before shaking, noting the man's firm grip and perfect smile. "Bit early for neighborly visits. You're not open for months?" Mercer's smile didn't falter. "Always good to get acquainted early. Actually, I wanted to discuss a potential opportunity. Jensen's is always looking to acquire established local shops. Gives us credibility in new markets." "Not interested," Frank said flatly. "You haven't heard the offer," Mercer countered smoothly. "Properties in this area are..." A sharp bark interrupted him. Diesel stood at attention, hackles slightly raised as he stared at the visitor. "Your dog?" Mercer asked, his smile tightening. "In a manner of speaking," Frank replied, noticing how Diesel had positioned himself between Frank and the visitor. After Mercer left, handing Frank a business card that promptly found its way to the trash, Mike approached again with his phone. "While you were talking, I got something cool," he said, showing Frank a video he'd captured of Diesel fetching a torque wrench. "Mind if I post it to the account I made for the shop?" Frank started to object, then paused. Mercer's visit had left him uneasy. The chain would open regardless. Perhaps Mike's idea wasn't so foolish. "Fine," he relented, "but nothing fancy." Mike's grin suggested he had bigger plans than Frank anticipated. Frank woke to the insistent buzzing of his phone. Bleary-eyed, he reached for it, wondering who would call at. He squinted at the clock, 5:47 a.m. But it wasn't a call. Notifications filled his screen, dozens of them, all from an app he didn't recognize. Beside him on the bed, something Frank had sworn wouldn't happen. Diesel raised his head, alert to his human's confusion. The phone buzzed again. This time, it was a call. "From Mike. Have you seen it?" the young man asked without preamble, his voice vibrating with excitement. "Seen what?" Frank grumbled, running a hand through his thinning hair. "The video. It's gone viral overnight. Over 50,000 views already." Frank sat up straighter. "What video?" "Diesel fetching tools. I posted it last night and it just exploded. People are sharing it everywhere. Check your email. We've got messages from people asking if they can bring their cars in." Frank fumbled with his phone, finding the unfamiliar app icon Mike had installed. The video was simple, just 30 seconds of Diesel retrieving different tools as Frank called out their names. But the view count was indeed climbing, comments pouring in beneath it. "Smartest shop dog ever. My mechanic needs to hire this good. Boy, that German Shepherd knows more about cars than my husband." Frank stared at the screen, unsure how to process this sudden intrusion of technology into his analog life. Diesel nudged his hand, sensing his discomfort. "I'll be at the shop in 20, he told Mike, ending the call. When Frank arrived, he was startled to find 3 cars already waiting in the parking lot, their owners leaning against hoods and fenders, with expectant expressions. "Are you the mechanic with the dog?" a woman asked as Frank unlocked the front door, Diesel at his heels. "My brother showed me the video, said I should bring my Subaru to you instead of driving to Westfield." By mid-morning, the shop phone was ringing constantly. Mike, energized by the sudden attention, moved between customers with newfound enthusiasm, explaining Diesel's abilities to each newcomer while Frank worked through the unexpected backlog of vehicles. "You should do more videos," Mike suggested, during a brief lull. "People love this stuff." Frank grunted noncommittally, though he couldn't deny the immediate impact on business. The appointment book, empty for weeks, now had entries stretching into the following month. Diesel, seemingly aware of his newfound celebrity, performed his duties with an almost professional demeanor. He'd learned the names of over a dozen tools, and could fetch them on command, navigating the busy shop floor with careful precision. "He's a natural," Clara commented, delivering lunch sandwiches to the shop, something she hadn't done since the early days of their friendship. "Always knew you needed a partner, Frank." "He's just a dog," Frank replied, but there was no conviction behind the words. That afternoon, Frank's phone rang again. This time, it was Valerie Chen from the county newspaper. "Mr. Harmon, I'd like to do a feature on your shop and your remarkable dog. The video's been shared thousands of times, and people are asking for the story behind it." Frank's first instinct was to refuse. He'd never sought attention, preferring to let his work speak for itself, but the morning's rush of customers had reminded him how precarious his financial situation remained. One good day wouldn't erase months of debt, just a short piece, he conceded. Nothing fancy. After arranging an interview for the following day, Frank found himself watching Diesel interact with customers. The dog had a gift for putting people at ease, approaching cautiously for pats from children while maintaining a dignified distance from adults until invited closer. "He's good for business," Tom Watson observed, stopping by with a box of dog biscuits. "Gives the place character, personality." Frank nodded, realizing the hardware store owner was right. Harmon's auto had always been reliable, but it had never been memorable, not like this. That evening, as Frank scrolled through the comments beneath the viral video, he was struck by how many mentioned planning visits to Millbrook specifically, to meet Diesel. His phone buzzed with another notification, 100,000 views. "Looks like you're famous," he told Diesel, who responded by resting his chin on Frank's knee. "Hope you're ready for your interview tomorrow." The dog's steady gaze seemed to say he was prepared for whatever came next. Frank wished he could say the same. Valerie Chen arrived precisely at 10 the next morning, a young photographer trailing. Behind her, she was efficient and direct, setting up her recorder while explaining her approach. People love human interest stories, especially ones involving animals, she said. I'm thinking local mechanic's rescue dog becomes internet sensation. How does that sound? Frank shrugged, uncomfortable with the terminology. I wouldn't call myself a rescuer. He was under a car. I got him out. Anyone would have done the same. Valerie smiled knowingly. But everyone didn't. You did. She glanced at her notes. Tell me about finding him. As Frank recounted the discovery beneath Mrs. Patterson's sedan, Diesel sat at attention beside him, occasionally leaning against his leg when Frank's voice grew quieter, describing the dog's condition. And why did you decide to keep him instead of calling animal control? Valerie asked. Frank hesitated. He wasn't one to share personal details, especially with strangers, but something about Valerie's genuine interest made him continue. My wife, Elaine, always wanted a dog, he said finally, pulling out the worn photograph from his wallet. We never got around to it, too busy with the shop, then she got sick. He trailed off, tucking the photo away. Seemed like maybe it was time. Valerie nodded, asking no further questions about Elaine, sensing the boundary. Instead, she shifted to Diesel's remarkable abilities. He seems unusually intelligent. Had you worked with dogs before? Frank shook his head. Never. He just caught on quick. As if to demonstrate, Diesel trotted to the toolbox and retrieved a Phillips screwdriver without prompting, placing it gently in Frank's hand. Impressive, Valerie murmured while the photographer captured the moment. Mind if we see more of what he can do? For the next half hour, Frank and Diesel demonstrated their developing partnership. The dog fetched increasingly specific tools, responded to subtle hand signals, and even showed how he could identify loose parts by gently pawing at them. He saved me crawling under a Honda yesterday, Frank explained, a hint of pride creeping into his voice. Kept pawing at the exhaust mount. Sure enough, it was working loose. When the formal interview concluded, Valerie lingered, watching Frank and Diesel interact with customers. There's something else, isn't there? She asked quietly. Something you're not sharing about why this dog matters so much to you. Frank was silent for a long moment, his hand absently stroking Diesel's head. Finally, he sighed. 8 years ago, my son Daniel was in a car accident, faulty brake line that should have been replaced. The words came slowly, as if extracted from a deep, painful place. He was 26. After that, I started doing free safety inspections for anyone who asked, even if they couldn't afford repairs. Figured maybe I could prevent another family from... He didn't finish the sentence. And Diesel helps with those inspections, Valerie concluded. Frank nodded. He spots things sometimes even I miss. It's like he knows what's important. The article appeared 3 days later, front page of the local section. Valerie had handled Frank's revelation about his son with sensitivity, weaving it into a story about second chances, for Frank, for Diesel, and for the struggling community of Millbrook. The headline read, Man's Best Friend Becomes Shop's Best Employee, How One Dog is Changing a Community. The piece included several photographs, Diesel fetching tools, Frank and Diesel examining an engine together, and one particularly striking image of man and dog in profile, both looking toward the same horizon outside the shop. By noon, 3 television stations had called requesting interviews. It's getting out of hand, Frank told Clara, as they read the article together over coffee. Is it? She challenged gently. Your parking lot's full for the first time in years. The diner's seeing new faces asking for directions to the shop with the famous dog. The hardware store sold out of dog supplies yesterday. She tapped the newspaper. This town's been dying since the factory closed. Maybe it needed something like this. Frank looked at Diesel, who had developed a habit of greeting each customer with a dignified approach, allowing a brief pet before returning to Frank's side. The dog who'd trembled beneath a car just weeks ago now moved with confidence and purpose. Still, Frank said, all this attention, it isn't what I'm used to. Clara patted his hand. Sometimes the things we're not used to are exactly what we need. The regional morning show segment aired a week after Valerie's article. Frank had reluctantly agreed to the interview, persuaded by Mike's insistence that it would be good for business, and Clara's gentle reminder that Diesel deserves his moment. The 3-minute feature showed Diesel in action, retrieving tools, inspecting vehicles, and demonstrating his growing repertoire of skills. The host, charmed by the German Shepherd's dignified demeanor, had dubbed the shop Diesel's Garage. On air, a name that was quickly embraced by social media and much to Frank's bewilderment by local customers. I've got appointments booked 3 weeks out, Frank told Doc Miller during Diesel's checkup. Haven't seen that kind of business since before the factory closed. The veterinarian nodded, completing his examination. He's put on weight, right where he should be now. That paw's completely healed too. He straightened up, giving Diesel a final approving pat. You've done good by him, Frank. He's done better by me, Frank admitted, watching as Diesel patiently sat for his treat. Back at the shop, Frank found Mike installing a hand-painted wooden sign above Diesel's corner. Diesel's Station. The young man looked sheepish when he noticed Frank, thought he deserved his own space, officially. Mike explained. My girlfriend's brother does woodworking. Frank examined the sign. Solid oak with carefully burned lettering and a paw print. It was quality work. It's good, he acknowledged, watching as Diesel approached his designated area, tail wagging with apparent approval. Mike's girlfriend Emily had become a regular presence at the shop, documenting Diesel's daily activities for the social media accounts she now managed professionally. What had started as Mike's impromptu video had evolved into a carefully curated online presence that showcased not just Diesel's abilities, but the shop's commitment to quality and safety. We've gained another 1,000 followers since yesterday, Emily reported, showing Frank her phone screen. And Jensen's Automotive left a comment inviting Diesel to their groundbreaking ceremony. Frank frowned. Not interested. Emily raised an eyebrow, but didn't press. Instead, she snapped a photo of Diesel alerting to a loose belt in Mrs. Patterson's Buick, which had returned for its regular maintenance. He's amazing with mechanical issues, she observed. It's like he can sense problems before they're visible. Frank had noticed the same thing. Diesel had developed an uncanny ability to detect failing parts, loose connections, and safety issues. 3 times in the past week alone, the dog had identified problems Frank might have missed during routine inspections. He saved the Johnsons a major repair bill, Frank told Emily, recalling how Diesel had persistently pawed at a Honda's radiator hose, revealing a hairline crack that would have led to catastrophic overheating. Caught it before it could rupture. That afternoon, Meredith Wilson from the county animal shelter called with an unusual request. We've seen the stories about Diesel, she explained. Adoptions are up slightly since the newspaper article, but we're still overcrowded. Would you and Diesel consider making an appearance at our adoption event next Saturday? People seemed to respond to his story. Frank's instinct was to decline. Public appearances, crowds, putting himself and Diesel on display. None of it appealed to him. But he remembered the dog's condition when he'd found him, how easily Diesel could have been another anonymous statistic in an overcrowded shelter. We'll be there, he said before he could reconsider. After hanging up, Frank noticed David Mercer standing outside the shop, observing the steady stream of customers through the window. The Jensen's Automotive representative had been making increasingly frequent appearances in the neighborhood, his initial friendly overtures giving way to thinly veiled assessment. Frank stepped outside, wiping his hands on a shop rag. "Help you with something?" Mercer smiled without warmth. "Just admiring your operation. You've certainly leveraged that dog into quite the marketing gimmick." "Diesel's not a gimmick," Frank replied evenly. "He's part of the team." "Of course," Mercer's tone was conciliatory, but his eyes remained calculating. Still, all this attention must be overwhelming for a small operation like yours. Our offer to acquire your business still stands. In fact, given your recent popularity, we are prepared to increase it. Still not interested, Frank said firmly. As Mercer departed, Frank was struck by an unfamiliar sensation, a protective concern that extended beyond himself, beyond even Diesel, to encompass the shop and what it had come to represent for the community. For the first time in years, Harmon's auto felt alive again, filled with purpose that transcended simple vehicle repair. The county animal shelter occupied a utilitarian building on the outskirts of town, cinder block walls painted, a fading blue, chain-link kennels visible through narrow windows. As Frank pulled into the parking lot with Diesel in the passenger seat, he was surprised to see the number of cars already present. "Looks like a good turnout," Meredith Wilson greeted them, her smile brightening at the sight of Diesel, who sat alertly beside Frank. Most of these people mentioned seeing Diesel online or in the newspaper. Frank nodded, uncomfortable with the attention, but determined to follow through. "Where do you want us?" Meredith led them to a small table near the entrance, decorated with paw-print tablecloths and a hand-lettered sign, "Meet Diesel, Millbrook's hero dog." Beside it stood a display of photographs showing shelter animals in need of homes. "We thought people could meet Diesel, hear his story, and then maybe consider meeting some of our residents," Meredith explained. For the next 3 hours, Frank found himself repeating the story of finding Diesel beneath Mrs. Patterson's car. Each time, he emphasized the dog's intelligence, loyalty, and the second chance they'd given each other. Diesel, seeming to understand his role, greeted each visitor with dignified patience, allowing children to pet him while maintaining a watchful eye on Frank. "He's so well-behaved," a young mother commented, her 2 children cautiously stroking Diesel's fur. "We've been thinking about a dog, but weren't sure about shelter animals. Best decision I ever made," Frank heard himself saying, surprising himself with his candor. "Shelter dogs know when they've been given a second chance. They don't forget." By mid-afternoon, 7 dogs and 3 cats had been adopted, a record for the shelter's monthly event. Meredith could barely contain her excitement. "This is amazing," she told Frank, as the crowd finally began to thin. "Would you consider making this a regular thing, maybe once a month?" Before Frank could respond, Diesel's attention shifted suddenly. Toward one of the kennels, he stood, ears forward, eyes focused on a small, trembling pit bull mix with a scarred muzzle. "That's Max," Meredith said quietly. "Been here 8 months, former fighting dog. Great with people, but scared of other dogs. Nobody wants to take a chance on him." To everyone's surprise, Diesel approached the kennel slowly, then lay down in front of it, head on his paws in a non-threatening posture. The pit bull, initially backed against the far wall, gradually inched forward, curiosity overcoming fear. Young couple who had been watching the interaction approached Meredith. "Is that one available?" the woman asked, nodding toward Max. "He seems to trust your celebrity dog." By the time Frank and Diesel left, Max had a pending adoption application, and the shelter had scheduled 3 more events featuring Diesel's adoption days. "You're good for business," Frank told Diesel on the drive home, echoing Tom Watson's words from weeks earlier. The German Shepherd, sitting regally in the passenger seat, seemed to absorb the compliment with characteristic dignity. At the shop, the next morning, Frank found a large envelope that had been slipped under the door. Inside was a foreclosure notice from Millbrook Community Bank, stating that the mortgage on Harmon's auto was 3 months in arrears, with payment in full required within 30 days to prevent foreclosure proceedings. Frank stared at the document, the brief surge of optimism from the shelter event evaporating. Despite the recent increase in business, years of accumulated debt couldn't be erased in a few weeks of viral fame. Diesel, sensing his distress, pressed against Frank's leg, looking up with concerned eyes. "It's okay, boy," Frank assured him. though the tightness in his voice betrayed the lie. "We'll figure something out." The day proceeded with its now familiar rhythm of customers eager to meet Diesel while having their vehicles serviced. Frank moved through the motions professionally, keeping his financial worries hidden behind decades of practiced stoicism. During a brief lull, Mike approached with his tablet. "Check this out. Someone posted Diesel at the shelter event. It's gotten over 200,000 views already." Frank glanced at the screen, seeing Diesel's gentle interaction with Max captured in a short video. The comments beneath it were overwhelmingly positive. "This dog has a soul. Look how he helps the scared one. I'm not crying. You're crying. Drove 50 miles to meet Diesel yesterday. Worth every mile. Got my oil changed and adopted a cat." Despite his financial concerns, Frank felt a flicker of pride. Whatever happened to the shop, Diesel was making a difference in ways Frank had never anticipated. "The national morning show called again," Mike added, trying to sound casual. "They want to do a longer feature. Said something about America's most inspiring working dog." The morning show segment aired live from Harmon's Auto, transforming the modest shop into an impromptu television studio. Bright lights illuminated corners usually left to shadow, and cables snaked between tool chests and diagnostic equipment. The female host, Caroline Wright, possessed the polished enthusiasm of national television, her questions designed to extract maximum emotional impact. "So, Frank, you've become something of a local hero, haven't you?" she asked, microphone extended expectantly. Frank shifted uncomfortably. "Diesel's the hero. I just opened the door." Caroline pivoted smoothly. "And Diesel has changed your business completely. I understand you're now booked weeks in advance." Frank nodded, aware of the cameras capturing his every expression. "People come to see him. They stay for honest repair work." The interview continued with Frank answering in his characteristically brief manner, while Diesel performed his shop duties with unruffled professionalism despite the lights and cameras. The segment concluded with Caroline kneeling beside the German Shepherd. "America, meet Diesel, the dog who's not just a best friend, but also the country's most skilled four-legged mechanic." After the crew departed, Frank found a thick envelope on his desk. Inside was the latest issue of Midwest Living magazine, open to a 4-page spread featuring Frank and Diesel under the headline, "Second Chances, How a Rescued Dog Rescued a Man and His Business." The accompanying note from the editor thanked Frank for the interview he didn't remember giving, likely pieced together from previous news stories. The magazine photos showed Frank and Diesel from their best angles, the shop appearing charming, rather than worn. One image captured them side by side beneath the hood of a car, their profiles remarkably similar in concentration and focus. "We made the cover," Clara observed, bringing in Frank's usual lunch. She tapped the magazine with approval. "Not bad for a man who doesn't like attention." Frank grunted noncommittally, though he carefully set the magazine aside rather than discarding it. The national exposure brought an unexpected wave of tourists to Millbrook, weekend visitors driving hours to meet Diesel and have minor vehicle services performed at the famous dog garage. The town's single motel reached capacity for the first time in a decade, and Clara's diner extended its weekend hours to accommodate the influx. "You're revitalizing the whole town," Tom Watson told Frank during a delivery of specialized tools, the hardware store's inventory expanding to meet Harmon's Auto's growing needs. "Chamber of Commerce is talking about a Diesel Day festival next summer." Frank shook his head in disbelief. "It's gotten out of hand." "Maybe," Tom conceded. "But the bakery sold out by noon 3 days running, the craft shops shipping Diesel's hometown souvenirs nationwide, and I've hired 2 part-time employees to handle demand. Sometimes out of hand is exactly what's needed." That evening, sorting through the day's mail, Frank found an envelope bearing the Jensen's automotive logo. Inside was a formal letter increasing their offer for the property by 30%, with an additional clause. retention of shop name and canine mascot for marketing purposes upon acquisition. Frank set the letter aside, troubled by its implications. They didn't want his shop. They wanted Diesel's story, his image, the goodwill he'd generated. The dog himself was merely a mascot to be acquired. As if sensing his thoughts, Diesel approached, resting his chin on Frank's knee in a gesture that had become their private ritual of connection. "Not selling you," Frank assured him quietly. "Not at any price." The next morning brought a more disturbing communication, a certified letter from Millbrook Community Bank stating that Jensen's Automotive had inquired about purchasing the outstanding mortgage on Harmon's auto. While no decision had been made, the bank was considering all options to resolve the delinquent account. Frank understood the threat immediately. If Jensen's acquired the mortgage, they could control the foreclosure process, potentially forcing Frank to accept their buyout offer or lose everything. Mike found him staring at the letter, Diesel pressed protectively against his leg. "Bad news?" the young man asked. Frank handed him the letter without comment, watching comprehension dawn on Mike's face. "That's dirty business," Mike said finally. "Using the bank to force you out." Frank nodded. "Corporate tactics. They see something valuable. They find a way to take it." "We could tell people," Mike suggested, indignation rising. "Put it on social media. Your followers would—" "No," Frank interrupted firmly. "This is business. I'll handle it." But as he returned to work, Frank wondered how he could possibly fight a corporation with seemingly unlimited resources, especially with the bank's deadline looming ever closer. Frank found the anonymous letter tucked beneath Diesel's water bowl early Monday morning. The plain white envelope contained a single sheet of printer paper with a message in generic font. "Dogs disappear every day. Sell the shop while you still have something to bargain with." His first instinct was to crumple the letter and ignore. It probably a prank or empty threat. But as he watched Diesel patrolling the shop floor, methodically checking each vehicle for potential issues, a cold fear settled in his stomach. The dog had become more than a companion or even a business asset. He represented a future Frank hadn't dared imagine before. Without mentioning the letter, Frank asked Mike to install security cameras around the shop's perimeter. "Just a precaution," he explained, when the young man raised questioning eyebrows. "Getting more equipment in here every week." Midweek brought an unexpected visitor, Jason Reynolds, the marketing director for Techno Tools, a national manufacturer of automotive equipment and supplies. The well-dressed executive arrived without appointment, observing Diesel's work with professional interest. "Impressive animal," Reynolds remarked after introducing himself. "Our social media team has been following his story for weeks." Frank nodded cautiously, wary of corporate interest after his experiences with Jensen's. "I'll be direct, Mr. Harmon," Reynolds continued. "Techno Tools is interested in a partnership. We'd like Diesel to become our brand ambassador." "He's not for sale," Frank replied immediately. Reynolds smiled. "Not looking to buy, just collaborate. We'd provide your shop with our premium equipment line, feature Diesel in our advertising, and offer a licensing fee for the use of his image. Your operation would remain entirely independent." The offer was substantial, enough to clear the bank debt with money to spare. Reynolds left a formal proposal for Frank to review, promising to return in a few days for his answer. That evening, Frank spread the contract across his kitchen table, reading each clause with careful attention. The deal seemed legitimate, with no hidden attempts to acquire control of the shop or Diesel. It would solve his financial problems while allowing him to maintain independence. "What do you think?" he asked Diesel, who sat attentively beside him. "Ready to be a corporate spokesperson?" The German shepherd tilted his head, his expression so serious that Frank found himself laughing, the first genuine laugh he could remember. "In years. Yeah, I know. It's a lot to take in." Frank was still considering the offer the next day when a frantic woman rushed into the shop, keys clutched in her hand. "My son's trapped in our car," she exclaimed, pointing to a minivan in the parking lot. The doors locked automatically with the keys inside, and he's strapped in his car seat. He's only 2, he's getting overheated. Frank grabbed his lockout kit and hurried outside, Diesel following closely. The toddler was indeed secured in his car seat, red-faced and crying, the vehicle's interior already noticeably hot in the summer sun. As Frank prepared to insert the tool between the window and door seal, Diesel began pawing urgently at the passenger side of the vehicle, whining with unusual intensity. "Not now, boy," Frank said, focused on the task, but Diesel's behavior grew more insistent. He ran back to Frank, pulled at his pant leg, then returned to the same spot, barking sharply. Years of working with the dog had taught Frank to trust these signals. He moved to the passenger side, examining the area Diesel indicated. The window was open a crack, not enough for a human arm, but potentially— "Good boy," Frank whispered, understanding immediately. He guided Diesel's paw to the narrow opening. The dog's slender limb slipped through, reaching down to the interior. "Look!" With careful precision, Diesel hooked his claws around the lock mechanism and pulled upward. The distinct sound of the door unlocking was followed by the mother's cry of relief. The entire incident was captured on video by a customer waiting for an oil change. By evening, Hero Dog Saves Toddler was trending across multiple platforms, with national news outlets requesting permission to share the footage. "Your dog's gone viral again," Mike reported, showing Frank the view counts climbing on their social media accounts. "People are calling him a hero." Frank watched the replay, noting the calm intelligence in Diesel's movements, the lack of hesitation, the precise control. Not for the first time, he wondered about the dog's background and training. "He is a hero," Frank agreed quietly, remembering the threatening letter now locked in his desk drawer. "And someone knows exactly how valuable he is." The man arrived just before closing on a Thursday afternoon. Tall and lean with military posture, he wore khaki pants and a polo shirt that looked freshly pressed despite the summer heat. His rental car, a black Suburban with tinted windows, stood out among the modest vehicles usually found in Harmon's Auto's parking lot. "Looking for Frank Harmon," he announced, scanning the shop with assessing eyes. Frank stepped forward, wiping his hands on a rag. "That's me." The man extended a business card that identified him as Marcus Delgado, special investigator. "I believe you have my dog." A cold weight settled in Frank's stomach as Diesel emerged from beneath a Chevrolet he'd been inspecting. The German shepherd froze at the sight of Delgado, his body language suddenly unreadable. "Sentinel," Delgado said firmly. "Come." To Frank's astonishment, Diesel, or Sentinel, approached the man and sat precisely at his left side, head forward, ears alert. "What is this?" Frank asked, his voice rough with sudden emotion. Delgado produced a folder containing what appeared to be official documentation. Veterinary records, training certificates, and photographs of a younger Diesel in a specialized service vest, Sentinel. It was part of an elite canine training program, Delgado explained, his tone professionally detached. Specialized in mechanical and structural inspection. Military applications originally, but we were transitioning him to civilian infrastructure. Assessment when he was stolen during transport 14 months ago. Frank's mind raced to process this information. "He was half-starved when I found him, injured." "Thieves don't typically provide proper care," Delgado replied coldly. "We've been tracking him since your videos went viral. The scanning behavior, tool recognition, mechanical issue detection, those are specialized training markers. Sentinel was the program's most promising graduate." The shop had gone silent. Mike and the remaining customers watched the confrontation with open concern, while Diesel, Sentinel, remained seated at Delgado's side, though his eyes never left Frank. "You have documentation proving ownership?" Frank asked finally. "All in order," Delgado confirmed, extending the folder. "I can arrange transportation immediately." Frank accepted the folder with numb fingers. The photographs were undeniably Diesel, though younger, and wearing a vest emblazoned with an official-looking insignia. Medical records, detailed vaccinations, microchip information, and specialized diet requirements. If he's microchipped, why didn't the vet find it? Frank challenged. Military-grade subdermal chip. Different frequency than commercial scanners detect, Delgado explained impatiently. Look, Mr. Harmon, I understand you've grown attached, but Sentinel represents millions in R&D and training. His skills are needed for critical infrastructure inspection. Frank looked from the papers to Diesel, searching for some sign of the dog's preference. The German Shepherd remained in position, but something in his amber eyes seemed to be communicating with Frank on a level beyond words. I need to verify these documents, Frank said finally, and I'd like my own vet to confirm the microchip. Delgado's jaw tightened briefly before he nodded. Fine, I'll return tomorrow morning. But be clear, Mr. Harmon, Sentinel is government property. Attempting to conceal him would have serious consequences. After Delgado departed, the shop erupted in concerned discussion. Customers who had witnessed the confrontation offered conflicting advice, some urging Frank to hide Diesel, others warning about the legal ramifications of defying government claims. Can he really just take him? Mike asked, watching as Diesel returned to Frank's side, pressing against his leg as if seeking reassurance. Frank studied the documents again, looking for inconsistencies or signs of forgery. Everything appeared legitimate, down to the official watermarks and sequential serial numbers. If these are real, yes, he can, Frank admitted, the reality of potential separation settling over him like a physical weight. Clara and Tom arrived shortly after hearing the news. Word traveled quickly. In Millbrook, bringing dinner Frank couldn't eat and support he couldn't fully acknowledge. There's something off about this whole thing, Clara insisted. Why wait so long to claim him? And if he's so valuable, why not announce the theft, offer a reward? Classified program, maybe, Tom suggested. Military doesn't advertise when sensitive. Assets go missing. Frank barely registered their speculations, his focus entirely on Diesel. The dog had resumed his normal behavior, showing no signs of wanting to follow Delgado, but he had responded to the command, recognized the name Sentinel. What do you want, boy? Frank asked quietly when they were finally alone in the apartment. Who are you really? Diesel or Sentinel offered no answer beyond resting his head on Frank's knee, a gesture of trust and connection that transcended names and ownership claims. Frank barely slept. Each time he drifted off, he jerked awake, to check that Diesel was still beside the bed, as if the dog might vanish before morning. Doc Miller had agreed to meet them at the clinic before opening hours to scan for the specialized microchip, though he'd warned Frank that his equipment might not detect military-grade technology. Whatever happens, Frank told Diesel as dawn broke, I won't let you go somewhere you don't want to be. The German Shepherd gazed at him with what Frank chose to interpret as understanding. At the clinic, Doc Miller conducted a thorough examination, running his scanner repeatedly over Diesel's shoulders and neck. Nothing, he reported after several attempts. But that doesn't mean it isn't there, just that my equipment can't detect it. Frank nodded, having expected as much. What about the rest of the documents? Do they look legitimate to you? Doc Miller studied the medical records with professional scrutiny. The vaccination schedule aligns with standard military protocols. The physical measurements match Diesel's build. Nothing immediately strikes me as fraudulent, but... He hesitated. Something doesn't feel right. The timing is suspicious. Frank agreed. Why now, after all the publicity, would Diesel's supposed owners suddenly appear? If the dog was as valuable as Delgado claimed, wouldn't they have been searching since his disappearance? One more thing, Doc Miller added, handing back the folder. Ask yourself why a specialized military dog would respond so naturally to Diesel if he'd been trained to answer to Sentinel. It was a good question, one Frank intended to put to Delgado when they met again. Back at the shop, Frank found a small crowd gathered in the parking lot. Word of Delgado's claim had spread throughout Millbrook, bringing concerned citizens eager to show support. Signs reading "Keep Diesel Home" and "Millbrook needs our hero dog" dotted the assembly. "They can't just take him," Clara declared, appointed spokesperson for the impromptu gathering. "We've started a petition." Frank was touched by the show of solidarity, but uncertain it would make any difference against government authority. Still, the community's response confirmed what he already knew. Diesel had become more than just his dog. He belonged to Millbrook now. As the morning progressed, Frank noticed Tom Watson speaking intently with Mike near the shop's side entrance. The hardware store owner beckoned Frank over, his expression unusually grave. "You need to see this," Tom said, holding his tablet. "Mike was reviewing the security footage from yesterday and found something interesting." The video showed Delgado's arrival from an angle that captured the parking lot. As the man exited his vehicle, he paused to check his appearance in the window reflection, straightening his collar. In that private moment, his posture changed subtly, becoming less rigid, more natural, before he reassumed the military bearing he'd presented inside the shop. "Watch his face when he first sees Diesel," Mike instructed, forwarding the footage. Frank observed the brief flicker of surprise in Delgado's expression before it was masked by professional detachment, the momentary widening of eyes, the infinitesimal hesitation. He didn't expect Diesel to be here, Frank realized, or he wasn't certain. "Keep watching," Tom urged. The video continued to a moment Frank had missed when Delgado returned to his vehicle after leaving the shop. Once inside, the man made a call, his animated gestures visible through the windshield. He appeared to be arguing, repeatedly shaking his head before finally nodding in apparent acquiescence. "He's not working alone," Mike concluded. "Someone's giving him instructions." Frank's suspicions crystallized into certainty. "Call Sheriff Dawson," he instructed Tom. "Ask him to be here when Delgado returns. And Mike, print still frames from this footage, clear as you can get them. When Delgado arrived precisely at 10, he found not only Frank waiting, but also Sheriff Dawson and a considerable portion of Millbrook's population." The man's confident stride faltered momentarily before he recovered, approaching with the same military bearing as before. "I assume you've verified the documentation," Delgado stated, extending his hand toward Diesel, who remained firmly at Frank's side. "Sentinel, come." This time the German Shepherd didn't move. "Interesting," Frank observed. "Yesterday he responded, today he doesn't. Almost like he's been trained to respond once, to establish credibility, then ignore subsequent commands." Delgado's expression hardened. "Dogs are inconsistent. That's why we're replacing the program with mechanical solutions." "Is that what Jensen's automotive told you to say?" Frank asked quietly, producing the security camera images Mike had printed. Delgado's composure fractured as he examined the security footage stills. The images clearly showed him on the phone in his vehicle, his military bearing completely absent. "You've been watching me?" he demanded, attempting to recover his authoritative tone. "Standard security camera," Frank replied evenly. "Records everyone who visits the shop, including your conversation with whoever's really calling the shots." "Sheriff." Dawson stepped forward, his weathered face betraying no emotion. "Sir, I'd like to see some identification, not just a business card." Delgado hesitated, then produced a driver's license identifying him as Marcus Delgado from Cincinnati, Ohio. "Now, would you mind explaining your actual relationship with the military program you claim to represent?" the sheriff continued. The gathered crowd had grown silent, sensing the confrontation's importance. Diesel remained at Frank's side, his posture alert but calm. "This is ridiculous," Delgado blustered. "I don't have to explain myself to a small-town sheriff or a mechanic." "Actually, you do," Sheriff Dawson corrected him. "When you come into my jurisdiction making claims about government property and attempting to take a citizen's dog. So either start explaining, or I'll detain you while we verify your credentials with actual federal authorities." Delgado's gaze darted between the sheriff, Frank, and the increasingly hostile crowd. Whatever script he'd been following had clearly not accounted for this scenario. "Fine," he conceded finally. I was hired to retrieve the dog. That's all I know. Hired by whom? Frank pressed. Delgado's expression turned calculating. I want immunity from any charges before I say another word. Sheriff Dawson nodded. If you cooperate fully, I'll speak to the district attorney about leniency. Jensen's Automotive, Delgado admitted. Or more specifically, David Mercer. He provided the documentation and photos, coached me on what to say. Said it would be easy. Just convince the old man the dog belonged to the government, and he'd hand it over without a fight. A murmur of outrage rippled through the crowd. Frank felt a cold anger settle in his chest, remembering the threatening letter and Mercer's persistent attempts to acquire the shop. So there's no military program? No sentinel? Frank clarified. Delgado shook his head. Not that I know of. Mercer said the dog had special training, but he needed a convincing story to get you to give it up. Paid me $5,000 to pose as a government agent, with another $5,000 when I delivered the dog. Sheriff Dawson took Delgado's statement officially, then escorted him to the station for further questioning. The crowd gradually dispersed, though not before several people approached Frank to express their relief and support. You should press charges, Tom insisted. Fraud, intimidation, attempted theft. Frank nodded, though his mind was already moving beyond Delgado to the larger threat. This was just a tactic. Mercer still wants the shop, and now we know he specifically wants Diesel. For what? Clara asked. I mean, he's wonderful, but why would a corporate chain go to these lengths for a dog? Because Diesel represents something they can't buy, Frank realized. Authenticity, community trust. They want to acquire his story, his image, make it seem like their corporate shops have the same heart as a local business. The attempted fraud had been thwarted, but Frank's financial situation remained precarious. The bank's deadline loomed just 3 weeks away, and Jensen's Automotive was still pursuing the mortgage. That evening, the town council held an emergency meeting to discuss the situation. The council chambers, usually occupied by just the 5 members and perhaps a reporter from the county paper, overflowed with concerned citizens. Harmon's Auto and Diesel have become vital to Millbrook's identity and economy, Mayor Wilson stated, opening the discussion. The increased tourism alone has boosted tax revenue by 18% this quarter. Various business owners testified to the positive impact Frank and Diesel had made on their operations. Clara reported a 30% increase in diner revenue. Tom described hiring additional staff to meet demand. The motel owner confirmed weekend bookings were at capacity for the first time in a decade. We need to protect this asset, the mayor concluded. I propose we start a community fund to help Frank clear his mortgage and prevent Jensen's from acquiring the property. A community petition circulated, gathering signatures supporting the proposal. Frank, unaccustomed to public attention, found himself deeply moved by his neighbor's determination to help. It's not just about me and Diesel, he told the assembly. It's about keeping Millbrook's character intact. Jensen's doesn't want to be part of this community. They want to exploit it. As the meeting concluded, Jason Reynolds from Techno Tools approached Frank with an updated proposal. After today's events, we're even more convinced that partnering with you and Diesel is the right move, Reynolds explained. We've increased our offer and added a clause that would help protect you from corporate predators like Jensen's. Frank accepted the revised contract for review, recognizing it might provide the solution to his financial troubles. But as he and Diesel walked home through Millbrook's quiet streets, he wondered if even this opportunity would be enough to save the shop in time. The community fundraising campaign launched with ambitious enthusiasm. Emily designed a website featuring Frank and Diesel's story, complete with a donation portal and progress tracker. The goal, $175,000 to clear the mortgage and provide operating capital, seemed daunting, but Millbrook had rallied around harder challenges before. We've already raised $12,000, Mike reported after the first day, showing Frank the website on his tablet. People from all over the country are donating. Someone in Japan sent $500. Frank nodded, grateful but uncomfortable. With the charity. He'd spent his life solving his own problems, taking pride in self-sufficiency. Accepting help, even from friends and neighbors, didn't come naturally. "It's not a handout," Clara told him firmly, sensing his discomfort. "It's an investment in something that matters to all of us." Meanwhile, Frank reviewed the Techno Tools contract with a lawyer Tom had recommended. The terms were generous and straightforward. $100,000 for a one-year endorsement deal, premium equipment for the shop, and legal protection against corporate entities attempting to acquire the business without Frank's consent. "It's solid," the lawyer confirmed. "Combined with the fundraising, it would resolve your financial situation completely." Yet Frank hesitated, sensing that accepting corporate sponsorship might fundamentally change his relationship with Diesel and the community. The dog wasn't a product to be marketed. He was a partner who had transformed Frank's life in ways no contract could quantify. After 4 days, the fundraising had stalled at just under $30,000. The initial enthusiasm had waned, and despite Emily's social media efforts, donations had slowed to a trickle. "We need something to revitalize interest," Mike suggested during a quiet moment at the shop. "Maybe another video showing something special Diesel can do?" Before Frank could respond, David Mercer entered, his corporate smile firmly in place despite the recent exposure of his scheme. "Mr. Harmon," he greeted, as if they were casual acquaintances. "I understand you've had some excitement recently." Frank continued working on the carburetor he was rebuilding, not bothering to look up. "Sheriff Dawson mentioned you might be facing charges for fraud and attempted theft." Mercer's smile didn't falter. "A misunderstanding. Mr. Delgado was an independent contractor who exceeded his instructions. Jensen's had no knowledge of his actions." "Convenient," Frank remarked. "I've actually come with our final offer," Mercer continued, producing an envelope. "Double our original proposal, plus a 10-year employment contract for you as shop manager, with full benefits. We'd even create a special role for your pet." Frank finally looked up, studying Mercer with calm assessment. "You still don't understand what this is about, do you?" "Enlighten me," Mercer challenged. "It's not about money," Frank explained, gesturing around the shop where Diesel was inspecting a customer's truck. "It's about creating something authentic, something that matters. People don't come here because we're the cheapest or the flashiest. They come because they trust us to care about more than profit." Mercer's expression hardened. "Noble sentiments. But the bank doesn't accept sentiment as payment. You have 17 days until foreclosure, and your little fundraiser isn't even close to the target. We're prepared to close this deal immediately and clear your debt. Otherwise," he spread his hands in a gesture of mock helplessness, "otherwise, you'll acquire the mortgage and force me out anyway," Frank finished for him. "I know how it works. Business is business," Mercer confirmed, sliding the envelope across the workbench. "You have 24 hours to decide." After Mercer left, Frank stared at the envelope, feeling the weight of the deadline pressing down. The community fundraiser, while touching, wouldn't reach its goal in time. The Techno Tools deal would help, but required careful legal implementation that might extend beyond the bank's timeline. "What do you think, boy?" he asked Diesel, who had approached after completing his inspection. "Should we take the corporate route?" The German Shepherd looked up at him with those intelligent amber eyes that had first connected with Frank beneath Mrs. Patterson's sedan. Whatever Diesel had been before, trained service dog, military asset, or simply an abandoned pet, he had chosen Frank as surely as Frank had chosen him. That evening, Frank recorded a video message on Mike's phone, with Diesel sitting attentively beside him. He spoke directly and honestly about the situation, the foreclosure threat, Jensen's attempts to acquire the shop, and his own struggle to accept help after decades of independence. "Diesel and I want to thank everyone who's contributed to the fundraiser," he concluded. "Whatever happens with the shop, you've shown us what community really means." Emily posted the video immediately, though Frank had little hope it would make a difference. With Mercer's 24-hour deadline and the bank's foreclosure looming, time was running out for Harmon's auto, and for the unlikely partnership that had come to define it. Frank awoke to persistent knocking at his apartment. "Door!" Diesel was already alert, head tilted toward the sound. The bedside clock read 6:12 a.m. "Frank, you need to see this." Mike's excited voice penetrated the door. Pulling on a shirt, Frank found his apprentice clutching his tablet, practically vibrating with excitement. "Your video," Mike explained breathlessly. "It went viral overnight. Look." The fundraising page displayed a number that seemed impossible, $97,142. Donations were still pouring in, the counter incrementing every few seconds. "What happened?" Frank asked, struggling to process the sudden reversal. "A tech billionaire." "He shared your video," Mike explained. "Called you the embodiment of American small business values and pledged to match donations up to $100,000. Then a famous actress whose German shepherd died last year donated $10,000 and asked her followers to contribute." Frank sat heavily at his kitchen table, Diesel pressing reassuringly against his leg. After weeks of struggle and uncertainty, the possibility of salvation had emerged from an unexpected quarter. "There's more," Mike continued, scrolling through notifications. "Techno Tools increased their offer. They want to make you and Diesel the centerpiece of a national campaign about American craftsmanship." Throughout the morning, the fundraiser continued. Its improbable ascent. Local news crews arrived to interview Frank, followed by a regional television station. By noon, the counter had passed $150,000, with the matching pledge bringing the total over $250,000, well beyond the original goal. "You've done it," Clara declared, arriving with lunch for the growing crowd at the shop. "Jensen's can't touch you now," yet Frank remained cautious. "Nothing's official until the bank gets their money." As if summoned by his words, David Mercer's black sedan pulled into the parking lot. The corporate representative emerged looking considerably less polished than usual, his expression tight with frustration. "What's this about refusing our final offer?" he demanded, approaching Frank without preamble. "Exactly what it sounds like," Frank replied calmly. "I'm not selling." Mercer gestured dismissively at the news van and gathered supporters. "This little publicity stunt won't last. Corporate backing provides stability that public goodwill can't match." "Maybe," Frank acknowledged, "but I'd rather take my chances with people who care about what we've built here." Mercer's professional veneer cracked, revealing the calculation. Beneath, "Jensen's Automotive has already purchased your mortgage from the bank. We can still foreclose if the full amount isn't paid by the deadline." A murmur of concern rippled through the onlookers. Frank felt a familiar weight settling in his stomach. The corporation had outmaneuvered them after all. Before he could respond, Diesel's bark cut through the tension. The German shepherd stood at attention, focused on an elderly couple emerging from a Cadillac at the edge of the lot. Frank recognized Albert Patterson, the county's most successful real estate developer and husband to Mrs. Patterson, whose sedan had concealed Diesel months earlier. "Looks like we arrived at an interesting moment," Patterson observed, approaching. "With his wife. Frank, Martha told me I needed to see this shop dog for myself, said he was something special." Mrs. Patterson smiled warmly at Diesel, who wagged his tail in recognition. "This is the one, Albert. Found him under my car, remember?" Patterson nodded, then turned his attention to Mercer. "You're with Jensen's, I take it?" "Albert Patterson." He extended his hand, which Mercer shook automatically. "I understand you've purchased Frank's mortgage from Millbrook Community Bank." "That's correct," Mercer confirmed, visibly recalibrating to address the wealthy developer. "Interesting," Patterson mused, "because I just came from signing papers to purchase the vacant property next door. Planning a small business incubator for the county." He glanced at Frank. "Your shop would make an excellent anchor tenant, assuming you maintain ownership." The strategic implication wasn't lost on Mercer, whose expression darkened further. "In fact," Patterson continued, "I'd be willing to purchase that mortgage from Jensen's right now. Fair market value, of course. Save everyone the trouble of the foreclosure process." Frank watched the corporate representative's calculations play across his face. Jensen's had acquired the mortgage as leverage, not as a sound financial investment. With the fundraiser's success and Patterson's intervention, that leverage had evaporated. "I'll need to consult with my superiors," Mercer hedged. "Of course," Patterson agreed pleasantly, "though I should mention that my offer expires when I leave." This parking lot. As Mercer retreated to make his call, Mrs. Patterson knelt carefully to pet Diesel. "I knew you were special the moment Frank pulled you out from under my car," she told the German Shepherd. "Some things are just meant to be." Frank looked from Diesel to the crowdfunding total, now approaching $300,000 with the matching contribution, to the property deed Patterson casually removed from his breast pocket. Against all probability, the pieces were falling into place. 1 year later, Frank stood in the doorway of the expanded shop, watching the morning sunlight illuminate the new sign, "Diesel's Garage and Rescue." The weathered building had undergone a remarkable transformation. 3 additional service bays, modern equipment courtesy of Techno Tools, and a dedicated training area where rescued dogs learned basic commands under the supervision of professional trainers. The adjacent property, once an abandoned warehouse, now housed Patterson's small business incubator, bringing new life and foot traffic to what had been a neglected corner of Millbrook. The town itself had experienced a renaissance of sorts, with storefronts renovated, tourism steady, and a renewed sense of community pride. "Coffee?" Clara asked, appearing beside him with 2 steaming mugs. The diner owner had expanded her business as well, adding outdoor seating to accommodate the increased customer flow. "Thanks." Frank accepted the cup, noticing Clara's glance. Toward the training area where Diesel was demonstrating proper behavior for a young Labrador retriever. "He's a natural teacher. Takes after his owner," Clara replied with a knowing smile. The fundraiser had ultimately generated over $400,000, allowing Frank not only to clear the mortgage, but to purchase the adjacent lot from Patterson at a generous discount. The Techno Tools partnership had provided state-of-the-art equipment and national exposure while remaining true to Frank's vision of authentic community service. Most remarkably, 5 other mechanics across the country had adopted the shop dog model, rescuing animals from shelters and training them as companions and helpers. 2 of them had completed month-long apprenticeships with Frank and Diesel, learning the methods they had developed together. Mike approached from the newest service, Bay, now a certified technician managing his own team of apprentices. "Mr. Wilson's here with the new rescue," he reported. Frank nodded, following Mike to where the shelter director waited, with a carrier containing a trembling border collie mix. "Found him abandoned at a truck stop," Meredith Wilson explained. "Extremely intelligent but nervous around people. Reminded me of someone else when he first arrived." She glanced meaningfully at Diesel, who had noticed the newcomer and approached with dignified interest. The monthly adoption events at Diesel's garage had become community fixtures, resulting in over 60 successful placements. More significant were the 7 dogs who, like the Labrador currently in training, had shown aptitude for mechanical work and safety awareness. 2 had already been placed with other garages, creating a small but growing network of working dogs across the region. "We'll take good care of him," Frank assured Meredith, carefully opening the carrier and allowing the nervous dog to emerge at his own pace. Diesel approached slowly, demonstrating the patience he had shown with each new arrival. The border collie sniffed cautiously, then relaxed slightly, sensing no threat from the older, confident German shepherd. "That's it," Frank encouraged softly. "Nobody's going to hurt you here." Later, as evening settled over the shop, Frank completed his daily ritual, checking each bay, ensuring tools were properly stored, and reviewing the next day's appointments. Diesel followed his familiar path, inspecting vehicles with the same thoroughness he had shown from the beginning. The younger dogs in training had gone home with their handlers for the night, leaving just Frank and Diesel in the quiet shop. As they climbed the stairs to the apartment, now renovated but still modest, despite Frank's improved circumstances, Frank paused at a framed photograph on the landing. The image, captured by a professional photographer for a magazine feature, showed Frank and Diesel beneath the hood of a classic Mustang, both focused on the engine, with identical expressions of concentration. Beside it hung the original Diesel station sign that Mike had created, preserved as a reminder of their journey. In the apartment, Frank settled into his favorite chair, Diesel taking his customary place at his feet. On the side table sat the deed to the property, fully paid, with Frank's name listed as sole owner. The document represented security he hadn't known in decades, but it was the German Shepherd resting his chin on Frank's knee that represented the true transformation. Who would have thought, Frank mused, scratching behind Diesel's ears, that the best business decision I ever made would be crawling under a car to help a stray dog? Diesel's amber eyes held the same intelligence and connection that had first spoken to Frank beneath Mrs. Patterson's sedan. In them, Frank saw reflected not just the journey they had shared, but the ripples that continued to spread outward to other dogs, other mechanics, other communities, finding their own versions of redemption and purpose. Outside, Millbrook settled into the peaceful rhythms of a small town, with renewed confidence in its future. And in a quiet apartment, above a thriving garage, a man and his dog rested in the simple certainty that they were exactly where they belonged.